Celtic mythology, historical facts, religious belief, and myths about Celtic gods and goddesses. Written by Bernard Hayes. Narrated by Zachary Dillon Brown. Introduction. The various fascinating evidences of the presence of the Celts, people of very ancient origin, are found even today in many European areas. The people of Celts spread their civilization to Brittany, Portugal, Ireland, and the Danubian area. Specific atmosphere reflecting the culture of the Celts and clear evidences are easily found in all these countries. Some traces of the existing Celtic inheritance are found in places in southwest coastal Ireland. People in several countries in Europe speak languages having their origin from Celtic language. These are known as Indo-European languages. Artwork with cultural traits connected with Celtic art has also been excavated from many archaeological sites. Presently, Celtic is regularly used to express the cultures and languages of Cornwall, Isle of Man, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, and also Brittany and France. Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, Breton, Cornish, and Irish are some of the languages still spoken, which have their origin from Celtic language. The study of history of Celts, including disciplines such as paleolinguistics, ancient history, and history of Celtic art, anthropology, religious history, mythology, ethnology, and folklore, have been taking place in the last 2 decades. Literary reference about the Celtic people was made by Hecataeus, a Greek historian in the 517 BC. The tribe of Keltoi, that's how the ancient Greeks referred to the Celts, is located in Rhenania, present-day West and Southwest Germany. The primogenitor of Celts is Celtus, who is the son of Heracles and Celtine according to Greek mythology. Ancient Romans used the word Celtae to refer to Gauls from the continent. Celtic myths were written only in the 11th century AD. These myths are quite ancient and are kept alive by oral tradition. Ireland and Wales are the main sources for the Celtic myths. The legends of King Arthur were originated from Wales, and to some extent from Ireland. Brittany is the origin for medieval Romans of Isolde and Tristan, which is very popular in British Isles and continental Europe. As per the Celtic myths, the Celts divided their people by social class and by clans. The nobles, such as chiefs and kings, are high among the social classes. They are a part of the warrior societies. The aristocrats dominated the warriors. Bards and druids are some of the other classes who were highly regarded for their knowledge. Ancient Celtic people were enclosed by a natural world on all sides. Celts were aware of the presence of nature and the total dependence on the fertility and balance for their basic comfort and basic nurture. Cuchulainn, one of the ancient Gaelic heroes, was endowed with superhuman qualities. The Hound of Cuchulainn is the meaning of his name. Earlier, he was known as Setanta. He was the daughter of Dectir and Lu Lampada. He left his home when he was 5 years old to join the Red Branch Knights, which is the Ulster army of the King Mac Nessa. He took his spear, his javelin, and his silver ball with him when he joined the king. Upon reaching the palace at Emain Macha, with his javelin and silver ball he beat 150 boys in the games. When he was only 7 years old, he killed Cuchulainn's watchdog at Ulster, which got him his name, Cuchulainn. By this act, he was entrusted with the responsibility of protecting the Ulster kingdom and its people. Ancient history of Scotland. People have lived in Scotland for over 12,000 years, right back to prehistoric times. The first people. People have lived in Scotland since prehistoric times, over 12,000 years ago. Remains of bloodstone tools and nut processing sites have been found on the west coast and Isles. These people had a Stone Age society, but gradually the ancient peoples became farmers, deforesting land for crops and keeping domestic animals. Maze How, Scara Bray, and stone circles. In this prehistoric period, people built some of the world's most amazing ancient monuments and tombs. Maze How near Stromness, or Orkney, is a stone-built chambered tomb designed so that the sun shines directly down the carefully aligned entrance passageway, flooding the main chamber with light on the winter solstice. Scara Bray, Also on Orkney is an ancient stone-built settlement with houses connected by covered passages. Dating back to 3200 BC, the houses are remarkably civilized with stone beds and seats. Between Skara Brae and Maes Howe is the Ring of Brodgar, a stone circle dating back to 2000 BC, and similar to Stonehenge. No one is sure what stone circles were used for, but they may have been used for astronomical observations and rituals. Celts, Picts, and Romans. The Iron Age took place in Scotland around 700 BC, and the native population traded and adopted new technologies. The Celtic knotwork and decoration, which is still admired today, began in this period, and the Celts loved to decorate metalwork and wore colorful clothes and jewelry. The Romans called the tribes of the north Caledoni, and named their lands Caledonia. The Picts, known as the Painted People, were one of the Celt tribes who inhabited Scotland. Named by the Romans, historians think they painted or tattooed their bodies, and carved standing stones, some of which can still be seen today. The Picts left little evidence behind, but many towns in Scotland still have Pictish names, Pinterweem and Pictocree, to name but two. The tribes in Caledonia resisted Roman invasions, and the Romans tried a number of tactics to keep the peace in the north. They built two walls, the Antonine Wall, which stretched from the Forth to the Clyde, and Hadrian's Wall, both massive undertakings and designed to keep the fierce tribes of Caledonia out of Roman Britain. Looking at history today, many of the ancient monuments, fortifications, and burial chambers from Scotland's long history can still be seen today. Combined with the traces of more recent history in castles, statues, battlegrounds, and architecture, looking at the history of Scotland is a fascinating perspective for the tourist or amateur historian. With so many thousands of years of human activity available, layered one on top of another, there are few places in the world which can compare with Scotland for the breadth of history and the quality of the archaeological evidence. Facts and history about the powerful and superior people of Central and Northern Europe. In this chapter, we take an in-depth look at the people of Central and Northern Europe and examine facts and history about the Celts. The Celts were a people living in large parts of Europe during the Bronze Age and Iron Age. Various designs of Celtic houses have been reconstructed, and these models demonstrate highly sophisticated building techniques. They dominated over the majority of the extremely diverse population groups that are known to have inhabited certain regions at that time in Europe. Celtic roots are found in the Rhine and the Danube, where their ancestors settled around 2000 BC, in what is now Western Austria, Bavaria, and Switzerland. It has been confirmed by archaeological discoveries in the town of Latin, Switzerland. But to exactly trace the lineage of the Celts back to antiquity is very difficult because of a lack of written history of Europe in the distant past. The Celts exerted a strong influence on other European inhabitants, which is still visible, particularly in the culture of Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. Cultures of these intriguing people had many faces. Depending on where they lived, they led a different life, occupied with agriculture, trade, sailing, fishing, or were engaged in handicrafts. Structure of Celtic society. The Celts did not build cities, but lived in small villages or strongholds called oppidum. They could use a potter's wheel and use the vehicle equipped with wheels, including the war chariot. Celtic society was organized in three groups: farmers and craftsmen, warriors and priests. Most appreciated were priests, the bards creating poetry, and the druids, who were both the keepers of knowledge about religion, nature, and history, as well as teachers, communicating their knowledge further and enjoying considerable authority. They were also chief advisors and solved conflicts and disputes. The typical family consisted of two generations, parents and children, or, most broadly, the older and younger members of the family. Related to each other, clans formed a tribe. The Celts had a custom of placing children in the homes of other members of the tribe for their early training and education. Farmers worked with farming, combining planting and husbandry. A farmer kept some livestock, which could include cows, sheep, pigs, goats, and possibly some chickens, while he was also busy with planting wheat, barley, oats, rye, and peas. Women in the Celtic society. The women in the society of the Celts were respected and independent. They could be wives, priestesses, or warriors. In the history of the British Celts, there are mentioned several queens of considerable influence, such as Boudica and Cartimandua, Roman-British queen of Brigantes Celts. Among the Celts, marriage took on different forms. One of such form was a marriage lasting for a specific period of time. There was also the possibility of divorce, initiated by both the man and the woman. Religion and arts of the Celts. Oldest Celtic beliefs were linked to the cult of forces of nature, fertility, and the power of the moon. Widely revered so-called matrons, 3 female deities presented with attributes symbolizing fertility and abundance. An important figure in the Celtic pantheon was Epona, goddess of fertility and protector of horses, ponies, mules, and donkeys. The Celtic goddess Epona was identified by her horse symbolism. She is often depicted with 1 or more horses, and Epona is either riding side saddle, or a mare, or is between 2 ponies or horses. Popular within the Celtic world, she was worshipped in particular in the east of Gaul and the Rhineland, but known also across the European continent from Britain to the Balkans. Other Celtic beliefs developed later, in the Bronze Age, and these were more strongly associated with the cult of the solar system and the gods, whose cult was associated with such figures as Dagda, Lu, Cernunnos. Romanization of Celtic culture and their religion became enriched by other elements such as the cult of the Egyptian goddess Isis. However, in Ireland, where Christianity was adopted rather quickly, the Celtic deities were accepted into the pantheon of Christian saints, and so, for example, became the cult of the Christian saint Brigid. Technology, warfare, and defense of Celts. Already around 1000 BC, Celts mined tin, copper, and rock salt, applying it to food preservation. They could also obtain salt from seawater. They had great skills in the area of working with metals. They often used gold and manufactured tools and weapons made of iron and bronze. The Gundestrup cauldron is an impressive artifact associated with the Celtic culture. It is a magnificent vessel made from richly decorated plates of silver that were assembled into a single cauldron. It depicts warriors and other scenery, and is dated back to the 1st or 2nd century BC. Celtic metal shield coverings and chain-link armor were much more superior to those used by other people. The iron horseshoes, spoked wheel, seamless metal wheel rims were the Celts' most important achievements. Their chariots had greater speed. Horses were much safer as the hooves and horseshoes protected them better from injury. All these skills, as well as knowledge of methods of metal processing and production of weapons, made the Celts superior to other less developed societies. The Celtic warriors were brave, mighty, and highly regarded and respected by other armies. The expansion of the Celts. At the end of the Bronze Age, about 1000 BC, the Celts started expansion into Western and Central Europe, and reached the territory of present-day France, Benelux, Switzerland, Italy, the Iberian Peninsula, and the British Isles. Later, they continued expansion into other regions of Europe. In the 4th century BC, the Celts entered Rome and soon were driven from there. About 3rd century BC, they entered Greece, sacked Delphi in 279 BC, and settled in present-day Turkey, and there, known as the Galatians, founded the city of Ankara. Celtic-Roman relations were never good. The Celts were considered by the ancient Greeks and Romans to be barbarians. Around the year 284 BC, the Romans entered the territory of the Iberian Peninsula and began to gain new Celtic settlements over the Atlantic. The situation began to change and was not particularly favorable as before. In 225 years BC, the Celtic Boii tribe, living in Bologna, clashed with the Roman army at the Battle of Telamon and suffered defeat. The Roman conquest of Gaul began. Celts counting on the support of Hannibal and supported his army, but after he left Italy in the year 203 BC, he had lost an ally. The Romans could easily attack Bologna and win. In the society of the ancient Celtics, Druids were priests, intermediaries between gods and men, as teachers, judges, and doctors. The Roman conquest of Gaul proceeded in stages. First, in the 2nd century BC, the Romans captured and colonized South Gaul, South, modern-day Provence, and the northern part of Gaul was conquered by Julius Caesar in 58 BC to 50 BC. The collapse of Celtic civilization. The conquerings of Gaul marked the beginning of the end of the Celts' dominance. Celtic people assimilated the new culture quite easily, though not without initial resistance, as we remember the struggle of Vercingetorix, the famous leader of his brave people. The Celtic languages were superseded by the universal Latin. The social structure of the Celtic society also changed, and the role of the Druids significantly decreased. 10 interesting facts about the Celts. When you mention the Celts to most people, they conjure up images of warlike people that fiercely defended their land, while also looking to expand and conquer. However, this is but a fraction of what the Celts were all about, because in reality, they had a very complex society that warrants further investigation. In this piece, we provide you with an in-depth look at 10 things you may not have previously known about the Celts. 1. The Celts are not from Ireland or Scotland. Despite the fact that the term Celtic has become synonymous with people of Scottish or Irish origin, the Celts were actually from an entirely different part of Europe originally. The Celts didn't really become part of the historical records until the 5th century BC, although they were encountered by the Greeks the previous century. By the time they are mentioned in historical texts, the Celts had already spread out across Spain, France, and a number of countries in Europe's Alpine region, Austria and Switzerland among others. According to many scholars, however, the Celts originated from western mid-Europe as part of the Urnfield culture, which began in 1300 BC. City of Hallstatt, Austria. Remnants of the Urnfield culture from which the Celts originated were excavated here, dating from 1200 BC to 500 BC. A huge prehistoric cemetery was found at Hallstatt, Austria in 1846, where over 1,000 burials were excavated. The settlement is believed to date from 1200 BC to 500 BC, and contains the remnants of the aforementioned Urnfield culture from which the Celts originated. There are actually as many as 8 distinct Celtic regions throughout Europe. Austrias, between the regions of Galicia and Cantabria in northern Spain. Brice, in Brittany on France's northwest coast. Kurnow, in the country of Cornwall on England's west coast. Galicia, on Spain's northwest coast. Ayr, Ireland. Manin, the Isle of Man. Alba, Scotland. Cymru, Wales. Each region had its own culture and language. However, new research suggests the Celts never lived in ancient Britain. According to John Colas, an archaeology professor at the University of Sheffield, ancient islanders never called themselves Celts, and it was instead a nickname reserved for those living in other parts of Western Europe. Colas also believes the Celts had settlements in Turkey. This is much further east than was previously believed. 2. The Celts did not leave behind written accounts. There is scant evidence of any Celtic writing system. Although there are some fragments of text, there isn't any real documentation of past events. In De Bello Gallicio, Caesar wrote that the Druids didn't want to trust their learning to writing, even though they did use the Greek script for their other writings. Instead, the Celts maintained an oral tradition of learning which was maintained by Druids and scholars for hundreds of years. In the Celtic world, learning things by heart was deemed to be a great virtue. Archaeologists have found remnants of inscriptions in languages such as Greek and Latin at Celtic settlements, however. Most of the written accounts of the Celts came from Greek and Roman sources, who were naturally biased since they perceived the Celts as the enemy. This is why we have so many documents which claims the Celts were savages. Given the source of this information, we need to take these statements with a pinch of salt. We also get a good idea of what Celtic society is like through artwork. 3. Celtic language survived after the Roman conquests. At one time, it was assumed that Celtic tribes had their languages phased out once the Romans conquered them. This is far from the truth, as modern versions of Celtic languages are spoken today, although Manx and Cornish are no longer extant. Manx, for example, was classified as being extinct as a first language in 1974. Celts speaking together. What a typical breakfast scene might have looked like in a Celtic village, people gathering to eat and speak with each other. Ancient Celtic languages such as Pictish, Lusitanian, Celtiberian, and Leptonic are no longer spoken today, but may have survived for several hundred years after Celtic tribes were Romanized. In fact, Celtic languages were spoken until the Middle Ages, but began to decline because of the lack of unity between Celtic people. There were a number of disparate groups which fought each other. As the Celts divided, the united Anglo-Saxons managed to stamp their culture across the Celtic tribes. 4. The Celts loved to trade. In around 600 BC, the Greeks established the trading colony of Massalia, Marseille, which paved the way for trading relations with the Celts. The ancient tribes finally got to sample exotic Greek goods such as olive oil and grapes, but the most popular import at that time was wine. The Celts probably traded items such as furs, tin, salt, and amber, which were gratefully received by the Greeks as these items were rare in the Mediterranean. 5. The Celts created a road network before the Romans. The early Celts created a trading center of their own near the source of the Danube River in 625 BC. It was the most important trading location in the Celtic world for around 150 years. By 450 BC, the Celts expanded their trading network throughout Europe and traded in luxury goods. At this time, the Celts created the famous Tin Road, which began in Massilia and spread to Britain and the Amber Road through the Moravian Gate into modern-day Danzig. Yet this road-building skill was not only used for long-distance trade. Historian Graham Robb analyzed the positioning of Celtic towns in Ireland, France, and Britain, and found the Celts had positioned them deliberately to mirror the paths of their sun god in what has now been called the most accurate map in the ancient world. The Romans probably based their road building on what the Celts did, and with a lack of written language to outline their achievements, what they did was lost in the mists of time and Roman propaganda. 6. The Celts were not primitive savages. As we mentioned above, the Romans, Greeks, and other sources depicted the Celts as primitive savages, which is effectively an outright lie. As you can see above, the Celts were able to create a sophisticated and advanced trading network before the Romans themselves achieved such a feat. While the Romans had the Julian calendar, the Celts had the Coligny calendar. It was given the name because it was found in Coligny, France, in 1897. It is comprised of a variety of metal pieces, covered with markings including numbers, lines, and holes. It took the world's best scholars approximately a century to unlock the secrets of this Celtic calendar. In 1989, it was determined that the finding was a lunar solar calendar, which calculated the time of the year based on moon and sun cycles. The calendar could predict the position of the sun months in advance, in what is a remarkably accurate timepiece. In fact, it is even more accurate than its Roman counterpart, which is wrong by 11.5 minutes every year. 7. The Celts were wealthy. There was a very good reason why Julius Caesar embarked on the Gallic Wars. He wanted money. While the legendary general claimed he was just pushing back barbaric boundaries, historians believed his main goal was to get his hand on the astonishing gold deposits found in Celtic Gaul. Caesar was heavily in debt, and this military conquest was perfect, as it also boosted his political career. It was once assumed the Celts acquired gold jewelry and coins through trade, but they had their own gold mines. There were 400 of them in Gaul alone, with countless more dotted across the Celtic landscape. 8. They were well groomed. Again, Roman sources claimed the Celts had long hair, were unshaven, and in general, were very dirty and scruffy. In actual fact, the Celts didn't have a single style, as it differed from tribe to tribe. It is believed some Celts wore mohawk hairstyles, presumably to frighten opponents, while freemen and commoners that owned land did typically have long hair. Archaeological excavations have uncovered a host of hair ornaments, including hollow golden balls, combs, and hairpins. Yet, there is also evidence of Celtic men who were clean-shaven with short hair. In terms of hygiene, it is now believed the Celts introduced soap to the Romans. They regularly bathed, and for some tribes it was mandatory for warriors to have a bath before their evening meal. 9. They developed iron weapons before their rivals. This is one of the main reasons why they were able to create an empire of sorts in Europe prior to their encounters with the Romans. The Proto-Celtic Hallstatt culture was among the first groups of people to create swords made of iron. The use of this metal for weaponry became widespread by the 6th century BC. Iron replaced bronze, which was an inferior metal. We don't really know how much of an advantage this gave the early Celts, as iron swords were in use across Europe by the 5th century BC. Yet even if their rivals did have iron weapons, they seemingly did not perfect the art to the same extent as the Celts. And this probably gave the marauding tribes an early advantage which they seized. 10. They were excellent warriors. We already know the Celts liked to fight, but it is often assumed they were ill-disciplined compared to their Roman counterparts. However, the Celts were actually very well trained, and more than a match for any army they came across. Such was their reputation for fighting that King Ptolemy II of Egypt enlisted the help of Celtic mercenaries during the 3rd century BC. However, they were a little bit too good for Ptolemy's liking. He feared they would turn on him, so he had them shipped to a deserted island in the Nile. One of the reasons why the Celts ultimately lost to the Romans was due to a lack of unity as opposed to a lack of combat training. It was common for Celtic tribes to fight among themselves, and this enabled the unified Romans to band together and defeat a dangerous foe. Incidentally, the Celts did not fight naked. They actually used metal plates, chainmail, and leather padding as armor. The Celts, unpicking the mystery. Swathed in myths and legends, the Celts, far from being a singular mass of barbarians, were made up of diverse, distinct groups who battled numerous threats, from the Romans to the Normans. Here, historian Martin Wall unpicks who the Celtic people were and introduces some of the key individuals who led the battle for Celtic Britain. When Greek explorer Pytheas of Massalia made a voyage of exploration to Britain over 300 years before Christ, he called the native people Breton-like, or the people of the designs, because of the crazy patterns that warriors painted on their skin. Breton-like, or Britanni, morphed into Britannia, or Britain. These early Britons and their neighbors in Ireland all spoke some form of Celtic language by the 5th century BC. Their religious beliefs, their gods and goddesses, laws and military methods, technology and art were common to all Celtic peoples, whose settlements extended from Galatia in modern Turkey through Central and Western Europe and the British Isles, all the way to Celt-Iberia, constituting Spain and Portugal. But the Celts were intensely independent and tribal. Even within Britain, a host of separate and distinct tribes zealously guarded their ancestral territories, ruled by kings whose ultimate legacy was based on divine descent. The priest-magicians who guided these kings, and their tribal peoples, the Druids, were described by Julius Caesar as having originated in Britain. Not all Britons lived in Britain, however. Britons occupied territories in an arc form from central Scotland all the way to the Loire Valley in France. As a result of the Anglo-Saxon invasions in the 5th century AD, many Britons were forced to immigrate, some to Armorica, modern Brittany, which is still named after them. Others went to Bretonia in northwest Spain. What made a Celt? The matter of how each wave of Celts was united and divided by both language and religion is one of lively debate. Celtic peoples throughout Europe and Asia Minor shared common cultural, technological, legal, and spiritual characteristics, and their languages were broadly similar, but no Briton thought of themselves as Celtic or British. Their loyalty and kinship connections were to the clan, the tribe. So they were of the Iceni tribe, or the Cornevi, or the Catavallani, first and foremost. In recent years, revisionist historians have sought to dismiss the traditional account of Celtic settlement, and indeed to disinvent the Celts as an authentic ethnicity with its own distinctive culture. Though I take note of current fashionable theories regarding each wave of Celtic arrivals in Britain, I have not strayed very far from the traditional view, which was that 3 waves of Celtic immigrants from the continent arrived, commencing around 900 BC. The first wave were called the Goidels, or Gaels. They pronounced the letter Q as Quu or Ku, whereas a secondary wave of Britons pronounced it as P or B. This linguistic difference has long been cited by philologists as the best evidence for distinct waves of immigration, some centuries apart. Finally, about 50 years before the Roman invasions, a tribe called the Belgae, or Boastful Ones, arrived, and established control over much of the southeast. They had been displaced in their turn by movements among Germanic tribes, and by the onset of a much more dangerous threat: Rome. The Celts at war. The first very formidable threat was Rome. The Roman seizure of the Carthaginian colonies in Celtiberia, modern-day Spain and Portugal, and Caesar's wars in Gaul brought them to the threshold of Britain. 2 brief but lively incursions by Caesar in 55 and 54 BC had forced the southern tribes to capitulate, but it was to be almost a century before a permanent Roman presence was established in 43 AD. The campaign to subdue and colonize Britain was savage and prolonged. The first great hero of the British Celts, Caradocus, fought an epic war for 9 years between 43 and 52 AD against the full might of the empire. A few years later, between 60 and 61 AD, Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe, led a spectacular and brutal revolt, which came within an ace of dislodging the Romans from Britain and wiping out the colony. The Romans gradually established control over what is now England and Wales, and pushed into the Scottish Highlands, but could never establish firm control even over the lowlands there. Even in northern Britain within the empire, there was a separate military administration based at York. Eventually, as the imperial system began to collapse, the unconquered Celtic tribes, along with their Irish cousins, as well as Germanic pirates, burst in upon the undefended area. The Anglo-Saxons established their own kingdom in the eastern part of the island, and epic wars took place between the small Celtic kingdoms in Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex. As these kingdoms constellated into England, desperate wars and political maneuvering took place for centuries, and Wales and Scotland emerged as nation-states. These contests provided the material for the legend of King Arthur, Old King Cole, and many pseudo-historical or actual Celtic heroes. Viking raiding and settlement affected Wales, Ireland, Scotland, Cornwall, and Brittany in much the same way as in the rest of Europe. Finally, the most formidable threat of all, the nemesis of the British Celts, arrived in the shape of the Norman invasion of England. Once they had established firm control of England, their wars of expansion against the Celtic nations commenced. Barbarian peoples? Much of what we know about the Celts is derived from classical and especially Roman sources. While we should be naturally suspicious about accepting these portrayals, they were at least contemporary, or derived, from eyewitness reports. The Romans had contempt for all barbarian peoples, of which the Celts were one. People who lived in the great forests of Central Europe and Britain were considered savages, from the Latin silva, a wood. All that was dark, shadowy, and sinister was projected onto these primitive peoples, and prurient, lurid stories propagated about their inhuman practices. The classical world of ancient Greece and Rome had been shocked to their core when Celtic hordes had sacked Delphi, and then Rome itself. Greek philosopher Strabo said that the whole race is madly fond of war, high-spirited, and quick for battle, and there is no reason to discount this opinion, especially in light of the abundant evidence of subsequent history. In fact, the Celts were exuberant and extremist in all matters. Their passion for war was no different from their passion for feasting, religious devotions, poetry, and art. The Celts liked to show off their wealth and status, and war gave the opportunity to display their fine horses, chariots, sword, golden torques, and similar accoutrements. If they were not actually at war with external enemies, or among themselves, then they would be composing bardic poetry about it, celebrating the ancestral heroes of the tribe. It may be true to say that there is a traditional martial eagerness in the Celtic temperament, but ultimately their military traditions were founded upon necessity. They had to either fight or be overwhelmed or exterminated. The Island of the Mighty. While it is true that few peoples have become so romanticized and mythologized as the British Celts, I believe that the attempt to denigrate and marginalize their history is in danger of doing great violence to a body of knowledge, which consists of far more than mere history or archaeology, the mythical lore which has become known as the Matter of Britain. The sovereignty of the British race within the Island of the Mighty was exemplified by leaders whose chief attribute was their alleged descent from gods, or their personification of gods and goddesses. The Christianization of this ancient mythical lore was the template for the quest for the Holy Grail and the Arthurian romances. These themes, reworked for the Anglo-Norman aristocracy and encrusted around the Tudor dynasty, which was of Welsh origins, became the legitimizing propaganda for the British Empire. Caradocis, the Beloved One, is perhaps the first of these, but Boudica too was considered to be a personification of the goddess Andrasta. Arthur, the supreme hero of the British Celts, distills much of this into complex myth, which may or may not be based on an actual historical personage. Whether he existed or not, the fact of his existence in the imagination cannot be denied, but there are plenty of real-life Celtic heroes to make up for that. Urien of Regod and his son Owain, King Cole or Coel, Maelgwyn or Gwynedd, Cadwallon, who almost reconquered the Lost Lands, Guthred ap Lewin, and many more. The extraordinary, sad, and glorious stories of the last years of Celtic resistance are reserved for Lewin ap Gruffudd, Prince of Wales, and also called the last Scotland's hero, William Wallace, who had other Celtic connections, and the son of prophecy himself, Owain Glyndwr. A legacy of this long battle for Celtic Britain was that it preserved a tradition, a pseudo-history or reinterpretation of history, which alleged continuity with ancient Rome and legendary connections to Brutus the Trojan, the supposed first king of the Britons. These traditions, bowdlerized from the Brythonic originals, became a corpus of literature called Brutes, which encapsulated not only history and legend, but also, crucially, prophecy. The so-called Matter of Britain was not conventional history, but magical. At first, the pure forms of these legends were confined to the Celts themselves, and inspired them to defend their lands or rebel against foreign occupation. The prophecies of Merlin promised that one day the Britons would be restored to the sovereignty of Britain. It was this desperate hope which kept alive a fanatical resistance for so many centuries. The struggle was ultimately doomed, but by an incredible twist of fate, the Matter of Britain was taken up by the Tudor monarchs to be reinvented as the British Empire. The consequences of that were to be world-changing, but for the British Celts themselves, the irony was that they were the first victims of this empire. Celtic religion, religious beliefs, and practices of the ancient Celts. The Celts, an ancient Indo-European people, reached the apogee of their influence and territorial expansion during the 4th century BC, extending across the length of Europe, from Britain to Asia Minor. From the 3rd century BC onward, their history is one of decline and disintegration, and with Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, 58 through 51 BC, Celtic independence came to an end on the European continent. In Britain and Ireland, this decline moved more slowly, but traditional culture was gradually eroded through the pressures of political subjugation. Today, the Celtic languages are spoken only on the western periphery of Europe, in restricted areas of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany. in this last instance largely as a result of immigration from Britain from the 4th to the 7th century AD. It is not surprising, therefore, that the unsettled and uneven history of the Celts has affected the documentation of their culture and religion. Sources. Two main types of sources provide information on Celtic religion: the sculptural monuments associated with the Celts of continental Europe and of Rome, Britain, and the insular Celtic literatures that have survived in writings from medieval times. Both pose problems of interpretation. Most of the monuments, and their accompanying inscriptions, belong to the Roman period, and reflect a considerable degree of syncretism between Celtic and Roman gods, even where figures and motifs appear to derive from pre-Roman tradition. They are difficult to interpret in the absence of a preserved literature on mythology. Only after the lapse of many centuries, beginning in the 7th century in Ireland, even later in Wales, was the mythological tradition consigned to writing, but by then Ireland and Wales had been Christianized, and the scribes and redactors were monastic scholars. The resulting literature is abundant and varied, but it is much removed in both time and location from its epigraphic and iconographic correlatives on the continent, and inevitably reflect the redactors' selectivity and something of their Christian learning. Given these circumstances, it is remarkable that there are so many points of agreement between the insular literatures and the continental evidence. This is particularly notable in the case of the classical commentators from Posidonius, 135 through 51 BC, onward, who recorded their own or others' observations on the Celts. The Celtic Gods. The Iocus Classicus for the Celtic gods of Gaul is the passage in Caesar's Commentari de Bello Gallico, 52 through 51 BC, the Gallic War, in which he names 5 of them together with their functions. Mercury was the most honored of all the gods, and many images of him were to be found. Mercury was regarded as the inventor of all the arts, the patron of travelers and of merchants, and the most powerful god in matters of commerce and gain. After him, the Gauls honored Apollo, Mars, Jupiter, and Minerva. Of these gods, they held almost the same opinions as other peoples did. Apollo drives away diseases, Minerva promotes handicrafts, Jupiter rules the heavens, and Mars controls wars. In characteristic Roman fashion, however, Caesar does not refer to these figures by their native names, but by the names of the Roman gods with which he equated them, a procedure that greatly complicates the task of identifying his Gaulish deities with their counterparts in the insular literatures. He also presents a neat schematic equation of God and function that is quite foreign to the vernacular literary testimony. Yet, given its limitations, his brief catalogue is a valuable and essentially accurate witness. In comparing his accounts with the vernacular literatures, or even with the continental iconography, it is well to recall the disparate contexts and motivations. As has been noted, Caesar's commentary and the iconography refer to quite different stages in the history of Gaulish religion. The iconography of the Roman period belongs to an environment of profound cultural and political change, and the religion it represents may in fact have been less clearly structured than that maintained by the Druids, the priestly order, in the time of Gaulish independence. On the other hand, the lack of structure is sometimes more apparent than real. It has, for instance, been noted that of the several hundred names containing a Celtic element attested in Gaul, the majority occur only once, which has led some scholars to conclude that the Celtic gods and their cults were local and tribal rather than national. Supporters of this view cite Lucan's mention of a god Tutates, which they interpret as god of the tribe. It is thought that Tuta meant tribe in Celtic. The seeming multiplicity of deity names may, however, be explained otherwise. For example, many are simply epithets applied to major deities by widely extended cults. The notion of the Celtic pantheon as merely a proliferation of local gods is contradicted by the several well-attested deities whose cults were observed virtually throughout the areas of Celtic settlement. According to Caesar, the god most honored by the Gauls was Mercury, and this is confirmed by numerous images and inscriptions. His Celtic name is not explicitly stated, but it is clearly implied in the place name Lugudanon, the fort of dwelling of the god Lugus, by which his numerous cult centers were known, and from which the modern Lion, Leon, and Ludon in France, Leyden in the Netherlands, and Legnica in Poland derive. The Irish and Welsh cognates of Lugus are Lu and U respectively, and the traditions concerning these figures mesh neatly with those of the Gaulish god. Caesar's description of the latter as the inventor of all the arts might almost have been a paraphrase of Lu's conventional epithet, Sam Ildenach, possessed of many talents. An episode in the Irish tale of the Battle of Mac Turida is a dramatic exposition of Lu's claim to be master of all the arts and crafts, and dedicatory inscriptions in Spain and Switzerland, one of them from a guild of shoemakers, commemorating Lugus or Lugoves, the plural perhaps referring to the god conceived in triple form. An episode in the Middle Welsh collection of tales was the Mabinion, or Mabinogi, seems to echo the connection with shoemaking, for it represents you as working briefly as a skilled exponent of the craft. In Ireland, Lu was the youthful victor over the demonic Balar of the venomous eye. He was the divine exemplar of sacral kingship, and his other common epithets, Iamphada, of the long arm, perpetuates an old Indo-European metaphor for a great king extending his rule and sovereignty far afield. His proper festival, called Lungsada, Festival of Lu in Ireland, was celebrated and still is at several locations. In August, at least two of the early festival sites, Carmoon and Talitiu, were the reputed burial places of goddesses associated with the fertility of the earth, as was evidently the consort Maia, or Rosmerta, the provider, who accompanies Mercury on many Gaulish monuments. The Gaulish god Mars illustrates vividly the difficulty of equating individual Roman and Celtic deities. A famous passage in Lucan's Bellum Civile mentions the bloody sacrifices offered to the three Celtic gods, Teutates, Esus, and Tyrannus. Of two later commentators on Lucan's texts, one identifies Teutates with Mercury, the other with Mars. The probable explanation of this apparent confusion, which is paralleled elsewhere, is that the Celtic gods are not rigidly compartmentalized in terms of function. Thus, Mercury, as the god of sovereignty, may function as a warrior, while Mars may function as protector of the tribe, so that either one may plausibly be equated with Teutates. The problem of identification is still more profound in the case of the Gaulish Apollo, for some of his 15 or more epithets may refer to separate deities. The solar connotations of Belinus, from Celtic bel, shining, or brilliant, would have supported the identification with the Greco-Roman Apollo. Several of his epithets, such as Granus and Borvo, which are associated etymologically with the notions of boiling and heat, respectively, connecting him with healing and especially with the therapeutic powers of thermal and other springs, an area of religious beliefs that retained much of its ancient vigor in Celtic lands throughout the Middle Ages, and even to the present time. Mapinos, divine son or divine youth, is attested in Gaul, but occurs mainly in northern Britain. He appears in medieval Welsh literature as Mabon, son of Modron, that is, of Matrona, divine mother, and he evidently figured in a myth of the infant god carried off from his mother when 3 nights old. His name survives in Arthurian romance under the forms of Mabon, Mabuz, and Mabonagrin. His Irish equivalent was Mac Indog, young son or young lad, known also as Oincus, who dwelt in Brug na Boine, the great Neolithic and therefore pre-Celtic passage grave of Newgrange, or Newgrange House. He was the son of Dagda, chief god of the Irish and of Bowen, the personified sacred river of Irish tradition. In the literature, the divine son tends to figure in the role of trickster and lover. There are dedications to Minerva in Britain and throughout the Celtic areas of the continent. At Bath, she was identified with the goddess Sulis, whose cult there centered on the thermal springs. Through the plural form Sulviae, found at Bath and elsewhere, she is also related to the numerous and important mother goddesses, who often occur in duplicate or, more commonly, triadic form. Her nearest equivalent in insular tradition is the Irish goddess Brigid, daughter of the chief god Dagda. Like Minerva, she was concerned with healing and craftsmanship, but she was also the patron of poetry and traditional learning. Her name is cognate with that of Brigante, Latin Brigantia, tutelary goddess of the Brigantes of Britain, and there is some onomastic evidence that her cult was known on the continent, whence the Brigantes had migrated. The Gaulish Suseos, possibly meaning the good striker, appears on a different number of reliefs and statuettes with a mallet as his attribute. He has been equated with the Irish Dagda, the good god, also called Eochaida Olateir, Eochaida the Great Father, whose attributes are his club and his cauldron of plenty. But whereas Ireland had its god of the sea, Manannán mac Lir, Manannán, son of the ocean, and a more shadowy predecessor called Tethra, there is no clear evidence for a Gaulish sea god, perhaps because the original Central European homeland of the Celts had been landlocked. The insular literatures show that certain deities were associated with particular crafts. Caesar makes no mention of a Gaulish Vulcan, though insular sources reveal that there was one and that he enjoyed high status. His name in Irish, Gorbniu, and Welsh, Gofannon, derived from the Celtic word for smith. The weapons that Gorbniu forged with his fellow craft gods, the Wright Lugtha, and the metalworker Cretin, were unerringly accurate and lethal. He was also known for his power of healing, and as Goban the Right, a popular or hypocoristic form of his name, he was renowned as a wondrous builder. Medieval Welsh also mentions a Maithen, evidently a god of agriculture, of whom little is known. Goddesses and divine consorts. One notable feature of Celtic scripture is the frequent conjunction of male deity and female consort, such as Mercury and Rosmerta, or Suculos and Nantosvelta. Essentially, these reflect the coupling of the protecting god of tribe or nation with the mother goddess, who ensured the fertility of the land. It is, in fact, impossible to distinguish clearly between the individual goddesses and these mother goddesses, maters or matronae, who figure so frequently in Celtic iconography, often, as in Irish tradition, in triadic form. Both types of goddesses are concerned with fertility and with the seasonal cycle of nature, and, on the evidence of insular tradition, both drew much of their power from the old concept of a great goddess who, like the Indian Aditi, was mother of all the gods. Welsh and Irish tradition also bring out the multifaceted character of the goddess, who, in her various epiphanies or avatars, assumes quite different and sometimes wholly contrasting forms and personalities. She may be the embodiment of sovereignty, youthful and beautiful in union with her rightful king, or aged and hideously ugly when lacking a fitting mate. She may be the spirit of war, like the fearsome Morgan or the Babtchada, raven of battle, whose name is attested in its Gaulish form, Cathubodua, in Haute Savoy, or the lovely otherworld visitor, who invites the chosen hero to accompany her to the land of eternal youth. As the life-giving force, she is often identified with rivers, such as the Seine, Sequana, and the Marne, Matrona. In Gaul or the Boyne, Bowen, in Ireland, many rivers were simply called Divana, the divine. The goddess is the Celtic reflex of the primordial mother who creates life and fruitfulness through her union with the universal Father, God. Welsh and Irish tradition preserve many variations on a basic triadic relationship of divine mother, father, and son. The goddess appears, for example, in Welsh as Modron, from Matrona, divine mother, and Rhiannon, divine queen, and in Irish as Boan and Macha. Her partner is represented by the Gaulish father figure Suculos, his Irish counterpart Dagda, and the Welsh Terinon, divine lord, and her son by the Welsh Mabon, from Maponos, divine son, and Pryderi, and the Irish Ongus and Mac Indog, among others. Zoomorphic deities. The rich abundance of animal imagery in Celto-Roman iconography, representing the deities in combinations of animal and human forms, finds frequent echoes in the insular literary tradition. Perhaps the most familiar instance is the deity or deity type known as Cernunnos, Horned One, or Peaked One, even though the name is attested only once on a Paris relief. The interior relief of the Gundestrup cauldron, a 1st century BC vessel found in Denmark, provides a striking depiction of the antlered Cernunnos as Lord of the Animals, seated in the yogic lotus position and accompanied by a ram-headed serpent. In this role, he closely resembles the Hindu god Siva, in the guise of Pasupati, Lord of Beasts. Another prominent zoomorphic deity type is the divine bull, the Dan Qualinge, brown bully of Cooley, which has a central role in the great Irish hero tale Tain Bo Qualinge, the cattle raid of Cooley, and which recalls the Tarvus Tregeranus, the bull of the three cranes, pictured on reliefs from the cathedral at Trier, W. Gur, and at Notre Dame de Paris, and presumably the subject of a lost Gaulish narrative. Other animals that figure particularly prominently in association with the pantheon in Celto-Roman arts, as well as in insular literature, are boars, dogs, bears, and horses. The horse, an instrument of Indo-European expansion, has always had a special place in the affections of the Celtic peoples. The goddess Epona, whose name, meaning divine horse or horse goddess, epitomizes the religious dimension of this relationship, was a pan-Celtic deity, and her cult was adopted by the Roman cavalry and spread throughout much of Europe, even to Rome itself. She has insular analogues in the Welsh Rhiannon and in the Irish Edain Icreda, and Macha, who outran the fastest steeds. Beliefs, practices, and institutions. Cosmology and eschatology. Little is known about the religious beliefs of the Celts of Gaul. They believed in a life after death, for they buried food, weapons, and ornaments with the dead. The Druids, the early Celtic priesthood, taught the doctrine of transmigration of souls, and discussed the nature and power of the gods. The Irish believed in an otherworld, imagined sometimes as underground, and sometimes as islands in the sea. The otherworld was variously called the Land of the Living, Delightful Plain, and Land of the Young, and was believed to be a country where there was no sickness, old age, or death, where happiness lasted forever, and 100 years was as one day. It was similar to the Elysium of the Greeks, and may have belonged to ancient Indo-European traditions. In Celtic eschatology, as noted in Irish visions or voyage tales, a beautiful girl approaches the hero and sings to him of this happy land. He follows her, and they sail away in a boat of glass, and are seen no more, or else he returns after a short time to find that all his companions are dead, for he was really away for hundreds of years. Sometimes the hero sets out on a quest, and a magic mist descends upon him. He finds himself before a palace, and enters to find a warrior and a beautiful girl who make him welcome. The warrior may be Manannán, or Lu himself may be the one who receives him, and after strange adventures the hero returns successfully. These Irish tales, some of which date from the 8th century, are infused with the magic quality that is found 400 years later in the Arthurian romances. Something of this quality is preserved too in the Welsh story of Branwen, daughter of Lear, which ends with the survivors of the great battles feasting in the presence of the severed head of Bran the Blessed, having forgotten all their suffering and sorrow. But this delightful plain was not accessible to all. Donn, god of the dead and ancestor of all the Irish, reigned over Tecduin, which was imagined as on or under Bull Island, off the Bear Peninsula, and to him all men returned except the happy few. Worship. According to Posidonius and later classical authors, Gaulish religion and culture were the concern of 3 professional classes: the Druids, the Bards, and between them an order closely associated with the Druids that seems to have been best known by the Gaulish term Vates, cognate with the Latin vates, seers. This threefold hierarchy had its reflex among the two main branches of Celts in Ireland and Wales, but is best represented in early Irish tradition with its druids, filda, singular fili, and bards. The filda evidently correspond to the Gaulish vates. The name druid means knowing the oak tree, and may derive from druidic ritual, which seems in the early period to have been performed in the forest. Caesar stated that the Druids avoided manual labor and paid no taxes, so that many were attracted by these privileges to join the order. They learned great numbers of verses by heart, and some studied for as long as 20 years. They thought it wrong to commit their learning to writing, but used the Greek alphabet for other purposes. As far as is known, the Celts had no temples before the Gallo-Roman period. Their ceremonies took place in forest sanctuaries. In the Gallo-Roman period, temples were erected, and many of them have been discovered by archaeologists in Britain as well as in Gaul. Human sacrifice was practiced in Gaul. Cicero, Caesar, Suetonius, and Lucan all refer to it, and Pliny the Elder says that it occurred in Britain too. It was forbidden under Tiberius and Claudius. There is some evidence that human sacrifice was known in Ireland and was forbidden by St. Patrick. Festivals. Insular sources provide important information about Celtic religious festivals. In Ireland, the year was divided into two periods of 6 months, by the feasts of Beltane, May 1st, and Samhain, November 1st, and each of these periods was equally divided by the feasts of Imbolc, February 1st, and Lunasada, August 1st. Samhain seems originally to have meant summer, but by the early Irish period it had come to mark summer's end. Beltane is also called Sestamain, first Samhain. Imbolc has been compared by the French scholar Joseph Vindries to the Roman lustrations, and apparently was a feast of purification for the farmers. It was sometimes called oimilk, sheep milk, with reference to the lambing season. Beltane, Fire of Bel, was the summer festival, and there is a tradition that on that day the Druids drove cattle between two fires as a protection against disease. Lunasada was the feast of the god Lu. The impact of Christianity. The conversion to Christianity had inevitably a profound effect on this socio-religious system from the 5th century onward, though its character can only be extrapolated from documents of considerably later date. By the early 7th century, the Church had succeeded in relegating the Druids to ignominious irrelevancy, while the Filida, masters of traditional learning, operated in easy harmony with their clerical counterparts, contriving at the same time to retain a considerable part of their pre-Christian tradition, social status, and privilege. But virtually all the vast corpus of early vernacular literature that has survived was written down in monastic scriptoria, and it is part of the task of modern scholarship to identify the relative roles of traditional continuity and ecclesiastical innovation as reflected in the written texts. Cormac's glossary, circa 900, recounts that St. Patrick banished those mantic rites of the Filida that involved offerings to demons, and it seems probable that the Church took particular pains to stamp out animal sacrifice and other rituals grossly repugnant to Christian teaching. What survived of ancient ritual practice tended to be related to Fildirect, the traditional repertoire of the Filda, or to the central institution of sacral kingship. A good example is the pervasive and persistent concept of the hierogamy, sacred marriage, of the king with the goddess of sovereignty, the sexual union, or B'nai Riki, wedding of kingship, that constituted the core of the royal inauguration, seems to have been purged from the ritual at an early date through ecclesiastical influence, but it remains at least implicit, and often quite explicit, for many centuries in the literary tradition. The 5 most terrifying civilizations in the history of the world. They say that those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it, so pay attention. It turns out that many of our ancestors achieved levels of violence that take them right out of the realm of badass and into the less cool area of ball-shriveling atrocity. These are the civilizations you don't want to face during, say, your next time travel adventure. And yes, the Spartans are down there. 1. The Celts. History is kind of shady on the Celts. They never wrote anything down, and many of the witnesses died brutally. But the facts that survived confirm one thing. They had gigantic Celt guts. First of all, they had a thing for severed heads. After a long and trying battle, they'd all unwind at the end of the day by collecting a few souvenir heads. Then, they'd bring them home and decorate the house with them. So the average Celt home probably looked like a hunter's trophy room, crossed with the scene at the end of Halloween, when all the mutilated bodies start popping up around every corner. Sweet dreams, kids. If they felt that yours was a head of particular importance, they'd embalm it and whip it out at parties to brag about how awesome they were. When they were alone, they'd probably wiggle your jaw around and pretend you were complimenting them. The reason for all of these head-chopping good times was that the Celts believed that the head held the soul, and so if you cut a dead guy's head off before all that juicy soul leaked out of it, it was yours. A finder's keeper sort of deal, you might say. So, were they really so bad? Hey, remember Braveheart, and how insane Wallace's army looked with their faces painted blue? Well, the Celts would sometimes paint themselves blue and fight completely naked, just because. One would assume that fighting in the nude would present some rather sensitive targets to one's enemies. But it seems that the Celts were so manly that they just didn't care. It was the ultimate insult. I am not afraid of you, and to prove it, I am fighting in the nude. 2. The Aztecs. You remember the Temple of Doom, and how that unfortunate gentleman had his heart ripped out right before they dropped him down the lava hole? Well, picture lots of that, only this time Mom isn't around to turn off the TV and stop your crying. That's the Aztecs. The Aztecs believed that for every 52 years that passed, the world would end unless the gods were strong enough. And as is common knowledge, the best way to toughen up a god is with a steady stream of constant human sacrifice, along with a dash of cannibalism, just for good measure. Most of the sacrificing went towards keeping their sun god happy, and it took place on top of a giant pyramid, so at least the view was probably pretty good. Then, they'd hold you down, saw through your ribs, and take out your heart, which was likely still beating. Then, as if things couldn't get any worse, they'd throw you down the staircase. So, were they really so bad? Yes. Yes, they were. Did we mention the cannibalism? After they removed your heart and threw you down the stairs, they'd eat your arms and thighs, and whatever other bits looked tasty. Some historians think that nourishment was the main reason behind all of this willy-nilly human sacrifice, as the Aztecs had no domesticated animals to slaughter, and as such their diet was low in fat and animal stuff. You know how it is if you've ever had a roommate try a vegetarian diet? It's just a matter of time until you start waking up with teeth marks on your extremities. And that's not even the bad part. The Aztecs held themselves to a high standard, and for every situation they asked, could we make this more gut-wrenchingly gruesome? So, for instance, during the sacrifice to the fire god, a newlywed couple would be tossed into, you guessed it, a fire. Then, right before they finally died, from their horrendous burns, they'd drag them out, flesh still smoking, and dig out their hearts. Wait, it gets better. There was the offering to the earth goddess, which involved a young woman's skin being removed, and worn around like a Silence of the Lambs-style serial killer flesh suit. On one hand, you might ask why none of the Aztecs thought this was odd. On the other hand, if somebody had an objection to the ceremonies, we're guessing they kept that shit to themselves. The Assyrians. The thing about the Assyrians is that they were basically the ancient Mesopotamian equivalent to the lovable team of underdogs in every sports movie. They had a lot of spunk and can-do attitude, but try as they might, they just couldn't seem to make it into the big leagues. Luckily for them, and unluckily for everyone else, just as that lovable sports team will sooner or later stumble upon a secret weapon, a magic dog with an unusual aptitude for kicking field goals perhaps, after a couple of 100 years of being constantly harassed by more powerful nations, the Assyrians came across their own secret weapon. No, it wasn't Emilio Estevez, but it was nearly as powerful. It was iron. The Assyrians were the first people to start using iron weapons instead of bronze, which, to put into a modern perspective, is sort of like showing up for a knife fight with the Death Star. Using iron made the Assyrians so near invincible that really, the other guys might as well have been swinging around bananas. So, were they really so bad? Well, in a word, yes. Here's a cheery little quote from King Ashur-Paul, who spent much of his spare time baking cherry pies for the homeless and teaching the neighborhood kids how to correctly adjust their bike helmets. I built a pillar over against his city gate, and I flayed all the chief men who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skins. Some I walled up within the pillar, some I impaled upon the pillar on stakes, and others I bound to stakes round and about the pillar. Many within the border of my own land I flayed, and I spread their skins upon the walls, and I cut off the limbs of the officers, of the royal officers who had rebelled. Ever have one of those days when you just wanted to get out of the house and flay somebody? Yep, you're probably a sociopath. Sure, we understand that intimidation was how invading armies ended wars before they started, that this kind of psychological warfare was crucial for a conquering army. But reading that up there, we're pretty sure the Assyrians just enjoyed it. 4. The Spartans. All it took was one movie, and now everybody knows the ancient Spartans weren't the kind of guys you'd want to invite to your fancy cheese-tasting party. They'd probably stumble in, mock you for not being a full-time member of the military, then impale all of your guests with spears. Not to mention, they'd eat all your fancy cheeses. And you know what? It wasn't just a movie. The thing at the beginning of 300 where they'd toss all imperfect babies off the cliff, letting them splatter on the rocks below, they really did that. But first, they would bathe the newborn in wine to see if it was strong enough to survive. That's right, being a Spartan meant you had to handle your damned liquor right out of the damn womb. So, were they really so bad? Every single Spartan male was a soldier. Every other job was done by slaves. The Spartan men were warriors, and that was that. They fought until they could finally retire at the age of 60, about the equivalent to living to 400 years old today. Of course, if you lived to be that ripe old age, were a good father and scholar, and all-around great guy, too bad. You didn't even get a headstone when you died. You didn't deserve it. The only Spartans who got marked headstones were the ones who died in battle daring victory. Think you're a war hero? Well, if you're still alive, that meant you still weren't hero enough for Sparta. Oh, and if you lost your shield during battle, you got the death penalty. A true soldier would have gone back to get it, or died trying. If we, or the movie, make them sound like heroes, well, you have to know about those slaves we mentioned earlier. The Spartans beat their slaves, by law. We don't mean the law allowed them to beat the slaves, we mean the law required it. Things could get a lot worse for slaves, though. As a sort of coming-of-age holiday, there was an occasion every year upon which the young Spartan men were encouraged to sneak around and murder as many slaves as they could, without having to feel bad about it. If you didn't murder anybody, they probably called you gay. The Mongols. Now imagine 400 of those stadiums, each full of people. Now imagine every single one of those people with grotesque stab wounds. That's right. It is estimated that the Mongols, under Genghis Khan and others, killed 40 million people. The Mongols ripped through the world like a lawnmower. They were like an army of Batman villains, only Asian and on horseback. When the Mongols got in a conquesty mood, if your town happened to be in the way, you were, as they say, out of luck. The Mongols would give you two choices, both of which thoroughly sucked. The first, and most practical, was to surrender and let them take whatever they wanted, which was pretty much everything, likely, including your livelihood and all the womenfolk. The second choice was to not surrender, and thus promptly watch your town burn to the ground, and your fields salted. Then, just to add another scoop of crap to an already bad day, you'd be brutally murdered. So, were they really so bad? During an invasion of India, a Mongolian general built a pyramid in front of the walls of Delhi out of human heads. Are you picturing it? If so, are you picturing like 24 heads there? Because this guy used 90,000 of them. They, like the Celts, had a thing for severed heads. They liked to gather them up and catapult them inside the enemy's compound. They would also fling corpses inflicted with Black Death. When they ran across pregnant women, they did things we won't discuss here. When you saw them coming, hey, you could shoot at them with your arrows and spears all you wanted. All you'd be doing is slaughtering the huge crowd of refugees the Mongols forced to march ahead of them as human shields. So yeah, You want to know why the Spartans have to settle for number 2? That's why. Conclusion. Hopefully, you found the above information enlightening, and perhaps it has helped increase your knowledge of a civilization that is often misunderstood and misrepresented. The Celts were indeed brave warriors, but were also great thinkers, inventors, builders, and creators. The main thing they lacked was unity, and this would ultimately cause their downfall.